Why the Great Molasses Flood was so deadly. What the hell? The storage wasn't OSHA certified and people drowned in molasses. What? It was like a perfect, if bizarre, terrifying, and very sticky storm. Around lunchtime, on the afternoon of January 15, 1919, a giant tank of molasses burst open in Boston's North End. More than 2 million gallons of thick liquid poured out like a tsunami wave, reaching speeds of up to 35 miles per hour of freaking molasses. Oh my, and the smell of molasses lingered for decades. What? Moves like molasses won't sound right ever again. No, it can go up to speeds of freaking 35 miles an hour. Wow.
The all-in-one website platform. More about them later in this video. Welcome back to Geographics. I'm your host, cosmic horror author and showrunner over at Story Rant, Eric Malachite. And today we're talking about one of the most insane disasters ever to grace the city of Boston, with a script provided by Ben Edelman. So be sure to show him some love in the comments while you're deploying your likes, subscribing to the channel if you're not, and sharing this video with someone who loves learning about places and the fascinating history behind them.
Okay. I'm ready.
Being one of America's oldest and most historic cities, a lot of interesting things have happened in Boston, Massachusetts. It was the cradle of the American Revolution, home to the most vociferous protests against British taxation, as well as the earliest battles of the ensuing conflict. Boston opened North America's first subway line in 1897, and the first ever World Series game was played in the city in 1903. It is home to the world's oldest annual marathon race, begun in 1897, and Harvard University in nearby Cambridge is the oldest college in the United States. To go along with all that history, of course, is a generous helping of folklore. When taking a tour of Boston on one of the city's famous duck boats, you'll probably hear the tour guide mention something called the Great Molasses Flood that happened in the city's North End back in 1919. Upon hearing the word molasses flood, your first reaction might be to scoff, to think that it sounds more like something that would happen inside Willy Wonka's chocolate factory than in real life. It does seem like the sort of whimsical event that would be dreamed up in the mind of a children's author. But for the people of Boston's North End on January 15th, 1919, the Great Molasses Flood was deadly serious business. An absolutely massive tank of the sweet-tasting brown liquid weighing more than 17...
Oh my god, can you imagine? Can you imagine? Holy shit! How do you clean up several inches or more of molasses? Yeah, like, what the frig? What the
1,000 Model T automobiles collapsed just after 12:30 p.m., flooding the surrounding area with a wave of molasses that smashed into buildings, vehicles, animals, and people with tremendous force. 21 people were killed in the flood and dozens were injured, many severely. Cleaning up the disaster area took months. And for decades afterwards, many parts of Boston smelled like molasses, particularly in the summertime. The tragedy would bring forth one of the most complex legal cases in American history, as victims and their families sued the owners of the molasses tank, one of the most powerful corporations in America at the time, for negligence. It would also leave its mark in the form of increased regulatory oversight of building construction, not only in Boston, but all over America. Still find the story hard to
definitely, you don't want that to happen again, you know?
believe. Well, I'm going to channel my inner Jonathan Franks, and we're going to change that.
This time we're learning about brown gold.
The people who lived and worked in North End, one of the Boston's busiest commercial neighborhoods, had grown used to living in the shadow of the above-ground storage tank in their midst by January 1919. It was huge, 50 feet tall and 90 feet in diameter, towering above all the other buildings in the area, including the elevated railroad
Oh my
tracks.
god, that's
It
it?
was one of the largest above-ground storage tanks in the country, capable
Holy
of holding
crap.
2.3 million gallons of molasses on behalf of its owner, the Purity Distilling Company. The city of Boston had a long and fruitful relationship with molasses, the sticky, sweet brown syrup that is a byproduct of sugar refining.
Oh my god, I want to see a simulation of this thing bursting and just molasses flying out of it. I want to see.
Centuries, it had
I
been
wanna
used in
see it.
America as a cheaper alternative to sugar as a sweetener, but its primary utility was that it could be distilled into alcohol, particularly rum. It was a central commodity of the triangular trade that brought slavery to America. Molasses was shipped from the Caribbean to New England ports where it was distilled. The resulting rum was then sent to Western Africa, where it was traded for slaves, which were then shipped via the infamous Middle Passage to the Caribbean, and the cycle started all
Holy.
over again. By the beginning of the 20th century, molasses was not only a food commodity, but also an industrial one. Purity Distilling was a subsidiary of the United States Industrial Alcohol Company, or USIA, which, as the name suggests, distilled industrial alcohol for molasses. This wasn't meant for human consumption, by the way, but was in fact a key ingredient in many factories, particularly ones making explosives. With World War I raging in Europe, every link in the munitions supply train was working non-stop to meet the incessant demand for weapons of war. This, of course, meant big profits for companies like USIA, who began shipping more and more molasses up from Caribbean sugar refineries to their distilling plants in the United States. The massive storage tank in Boston was designed as an intermediary stop for this molasses. It was offloaded from cargo ships into the tank and then emptied into rail cars and transferred to Purity Distilling's factory in nearby East Cambridge as needed. The resulting alcohol was then sold to munitions plants and other corporate customers. Even national governments placed large orders. It was a fairly simple operation and a safe one, at least in the minds of the men who owned and managed the storage tank. After all, they were dealing with molasses, and how dangerous could molasses possibly be? If you don't want your business getting stuck like the victims of the Boston Molasses Flood, you're going to need a fancy website, and today's sponsor, Squarespace, is just what you're looking for. Squarespace is the all-in-one website platform perfect for entrepreneurs. Whether you're a businessman looking for a cheap way to store syrup or anything else, Squarespace has all the tools you need to get the job done, all in one place and on your terms. With Squarespace's next-generation website engine, the Fluid engine, you'll be able to choose from a template and customize it to your heart's content. And unlike using an expensive web designer, your website will be fully functional on desktop and mobile from the get-go. And now introducing Design Intelligence, Squarespace's brand new service that combines 2 decades of industry-leading design expertise with cutting-edge AI technology to unlock your strongest creative potential. Design Intelligence empowers anyone to build a beautiful, more personalized website tailored to their unique needs and craft a bespoke digital identity to use across one's entire online presence. And best of all, if you're looking to sell your wares on your website, Squarespace offers flexible payment options with simple but powerful tools. Accept credit cards, PayPal, and Apple Pay, and in eligible countries, your customers will have the option to buy now and pay later with Afterpay and ClearPay. Ready to get started? Check out squarespace.com for a free trial, and when you're ready to launch, go to squarespace.com/geographics to save 10% off your first purchase of a website or domain. Now, let's get back to the video.
Wave of death.
January 15th, 1919 was a typical workday in the North End. Horse-drawn wagons and more modern automobiles trundled up and down Commercial Street, right past the huge tank painted the same color as the molasses it contained. At the neighboring streetcar depot and paving yard, workmen paid by the city were either on their lunch break or just about to be. While in the houses across the street, men and women went about their daily routine. No one was prepared for what happened next. Surviving witnesses reported that around 12:30 p.m. they heard a rapid-fire noise that sounded similar to a machine gun firing. Then, with a grinding crash, the huge structure of the molasses tank virtually disintegrated, sending forth a wave of molasses in all directions. 2 days earlier, the tank had been filled to near capacity, containing more than 2.3 million gallons of molasses, which is 40% heavier than water, by the way. The total
Yeah,
weight of the molasses
yeah, the rivets and welds popping. Oh my god, that would be terrifying. That would be so
in the
terrifying.
tank was estimated at an astonishing 26 million pounds, or 13,000 tons. It was
Holy
heavier
shit.
than 100 train locomotives, or 20 of the US Navy's R-class submarines, and now all that energy was being directed at the shocked inhabitants of the North End. A wave of molasses 25 feet high and 160 feet wide flooded Commercial Street, smashing into everything in its path with tremendous force. Anyone
Oh my god, I need a video. I need to see the absolute, like, because I just cannot imagine molasses coming out at that kind of speed. Okay, lamb, good night. Sleep well.
caught out in the open stood virtually no chance, as the deluge struck them full on, either asphyxiating them or crushing them against buildings,
Oh my god.
vehicles, or locomotives. Those in nearby buildings didn't fare much better, as the wave of molasses smashed into them, knocking entire homes off their foundations and flooding basements, drowning anyone unlucky enough to be there at the time.
Oh
The
my
destruction
god.
ranged for nearly a mile down Commercial Street, flooding it with molasses that was in many places waist or chest high. The sticky brown substance attached itself to flood victims like glue, making it difficult to escape. Then, as the air turned colder, as it got darker, the molasses began to harden, further complicating rescue efforts. Hundreds of thousands of gallons of molasses poured into Boston Harbor, staining the water brown for months. Nearby hospitals were flooded with casualties, many suffering horrific injuries that would leave them permanently disabled, assuming they survived in the first place. Not everyone was so lucky, though.
Damn. Yeah, the aftermath.
The molasses flood was front page news in Boston for
Now they have sweet tea in the harbor. Everyone just go get your free sweet tea. Just dunk your cup in the harbor.
more than a week, temporarily displacing talk of prohibition and the Versailles Treaty. Pictures of the destruction appeared in newspapers all over the country as the public marveled that a substance as innocuous as molasses could cause a disaster on this scale. 21 people ranging in age from 10 to 78 were killed in the flood, and over 150 were injured, many seriously. Dozens of horses were killed or horrifically maimed in the disaster. One of the most persistent sounds in the area on the day of the disaster was gunshots, as police officers shot the injured horses to put them out of their misery. There had never been anything like the Boston Molasses Flood before, anywhere in the world. The closest parallel was the London beer flood of 1814, when a 22-foot tall wooden vat of beer at the brewery
What? What? Oh, oh my god. Oh my god, there's a beer flood. Everyone get your cups. Go on. Go get yourself some beer. Hurry up before it's all gone, and whiskey. Oh my gosh. Oh my gosh. I need to find these two now. Everything's just getting drunk. Frick my life. What the
in
hell?
the British capital's St. Giles neighborhood exploded, killing 8 people. But even that was small potatoes in comparison to the molasses disaster, with less than a tenth the amount of liquid being released, to say nothing of the weight. Beyond the human toll, the physical damage caused by the molasses was immense, cutting the Boston Elevated Railroad, nearly derailing a passing train in the process, and smashing up many of the surrounding buildings, completely destroying the paving yard and the streetcar depot, as well as the firehouse and several homes, along with automobiles, wagons, and rolling stock. Actually getting
yeah, because it's like a thick liquid, so we're going deep into food-related floods. Let's go.
Rid of the molasses proved to be difficult. Initial attempts to wash it away using fire hoses in the city's fresh water mains was ineffective, and the workmen eventually figured out that salt water from the harbor was better suited to the task. Still,
Oh.
it took weeks to remove it from the immediate area, and even
Okay.
took longer to get rid of the taint of molasses that had been spread all over Boston. Anyone who'd been down at the disaster scene tracked molasses with them when they left, leaving it on train cars, payphones, city streets, in horses'
Oh,
water trucks,
no.
and in thousands of private homes.
True.
As bad as the disaster was, it could have actually been worse had it happened in summer as opposed to winter. The flood swept over a mostly empty park that would have been filled with young children and families in summer,
Ooh,
and the sweet syrup
yeah.
would no doubt have attracted billions or trillions of insects and rodents, which would have spread disease and misery among surviving residents. Initial speculation on the cause of the disaster by investigating authorities was that the tank had been destroyed deliberately with a bomb. That was certainly the theory put forward by the tank's owner, Purity Distilling, and their parent company, USIA. And at first, it didn't seem like an implausible theory. 90% of the people who lived in the North End were Italian immigrants, most of whom were relatively recent arrivals in the United States. They were viewed with
Okay.
suspicion and derision by much of the American citizenry, much as Chinese, Irish, and Jewish immigrants had been in previous decades. Woodrow Wilson, prior to becoming America's president, had written that Italian immigrants came from the lowest class of Italy, and that they were lacking skill, energy, initiative, and quick intelligence. Others were even less charitable. Italian immigrants were lynched more frequently than any other group except African Americans during this time period. Which sucks, but as a
Damn,
result
okay.
of this discrimination, Italians tended to retreat into their own neighborhood enclaves where they could speak to each other in their own language and look out for each other. Few of them participated in local or national politics, except for a group broadly known as anarchists. The anarchists were actually a loosely aligned group of independent cells of radicals, many of whom were followers of the Italian anarchist Luigi Galliani. Galliani was a proponent of the propaganda of the deed, in other words, affecting social and political change through violent action. Anarchists had been responsible for a series of high-profile assassinations of heads of state in Europe and America in the previous 2 decades, and had recently stepped up their game to include bombings of political and industrial targets. USIA was an important cog in the Allied war effort during the recently concluded World War, and were seen by anarchists as being a prime example of capitalism run amok. A failed dynamite bomb had been found at one of the company's distilling plants in 1916, and that same year, a bomb exploded at a police station only a few blocks from the molasses tank. It was believed that the North End neighborhood was the hotbed of militant anarchist activity in Boston at the time the tank had burst, so it was not hard to imagine that some nefarious actor had deliberately destroyed the tank in an act of social
Yeah, I guess I can see how they would think that then.
revolution. The facts, however, soon proved otherwise. Normally, an explosion includes a blast wave, a supersonic rush of energy that precedes the shrapnel and the fireball. This wave is usually powerful enough to shatter windows in an extended area around the point of detonation, even in buildings otherwise unaffected by the explosion. In the North End, however, there was no evidence of a blast wave. The only broken windows were those struck by the wave of molasses. Even windows on the upper floors of those same buildings were still intact. This and other signs, including the fact that nobody had seen anyone in or around the area of the tank despite it being the middle of the day, led experts to conclude that the tank had not been destroyed deliberately. But if anarchists weren't to blame for the disaster, who was?
Matter of negligence.
With terrorism ruled out as a suspect, attention turned to the design of the storage tank itself. When the tank had been built at the site just over 3 years earlier, plans had been delivered to the city office detailing how it was to be built. A series of curved steel plates, just over 2/3 of an inch thick, were joined together with rivets, a simple cylindrical construction that was assembled over the course of a month in December 1915. Critically, because the tank was designated as a receptacle and not a building, the company only needed to get a building permit for the concrete foundation, and not the tank itself, despite how large it was. This already pointed to a serious loophole in administrative oversight that needed to be addressed. In part because of this lack of oversight, there were no engineers or architects involved in the tank's construction. The head of the project was Arthur Gell, Purity Distilling's
Okay.
treasurer, who'd been assigned the task despite being an accountant and administrator by trade with no experience putting up buildings. Making matters worse, those toiling to put the tank together in December 1915 were under pressure to finish it before the end of the year, when it was expected the first deliveries of molasses would be arriving via steamship from the Caribbean. If the tank wasn't ready by then, USIA would have to pay to store it somewhere else. Between the rush job and the lack of engineering oversight, it is not surprising in the least that the molasses tank leaked almost from the moment it was first filled. Gel neglected to perform the customary pre-usage test of the tank by filling it with water because, in his words, there wasn't enough time and he didn't feel it was worth the expense. Brown streams of product routinely poured out from poorly aligned rivet holes and puddled on the ground at the base of the tank. Neighborhood children were accustomed to sneaking onto the premises with buckets to collect molasses for their mothers to use at home. Despite having the tank caulked twice, it still leaked, an indication that something more serious was wrong with it. However, the company did not have the structure inspected for safety, instead choosing to paint the tank brown in order to hide the stains left by leaking molasses.
Oh my gosh. They were like, oh my god, it's leaking and we don't want to freaking fix it, so just paint it the same color. Then they won't even know the difference.
Even more shockingly, examination of the tank wreckage showed that the tank's
It'll just
plates,
blend in.
which were questionable
Just cover it
as
up.
originally designed already, were actually 10% thinner than the plans originally called for, something any competent engineer would have noticed, but Arthur Gell did not. A modern study conducted in 2014 concluded that the steel was actually half as thick as it should have been for a tank that size, holding the amount of molasses that it was expected to. Most likely, the failure began at one of the flawed rivet holes, where a crack probably formed either during construction or soon afterwards. Every time the tank was filled, it put pressure on the structure as the steel flexed outward slightly under the pressure of millions of pounds of molasses.
Oh gosh.
Then when the tank emptied, the steel flexed back. Every time the steel flexed back and forth, the crack grew ever so slightly, wider and longer, a process known in engineering as metal fatigue. Finally, on the day of the disaster, the crack reached the point of criticality, and the pressure of the molasses was too much for the compromised structure, tearing it apart. The machine gun-like noise heard by witnesses just prior to the disaster was most likely dozens of rivets failing and popping free from the tank almost all at once.
Legal and social ramifications.
Despite it being a clear-cut case of corporate negligence, USIA putting its profits over the lives of the people who lived and worked in the North End, no one was held criminally responsible for the tank's failure, as a Boston grand jury declined to indict anyone on manslaughter charges. For victims of the disaster and their families, justice would have to be achieved in the civil court system. And in August 1920, a class action lawsuit, Dorr v. United States Industrial Alcohol, got underway at Suffolk County Courthouse. The complicated case would last for years, one of the largest and longest class action suits in American history at the time. Finally, April 1925, presiding auditor Hugh Ogden delivered his verdict. He blamed USIA, Purity Distilling, and its managers for the Boston Molasses Flood, harshly criticizing them for their decision to install one of the largest above-ground storage tanks in the country in the heart of a busy neighborhood without even a single attempt to verify that it was safe.
For real, like,
and that
what
when
the
presented
hell?
with evidence the construction was faulty, they ignored it. In their rush to take advantage of the huge profits offered by the World War, they had erected a ticking time bomb in the North End that was always going to fail sooner or later with disastrous consequences. USIA agreed to pay a financial settlement of $628,000 to settle the suit, an amount worth around $11.5 million in today's money. It may not seem very big to you, certainly less than the billions they'd no doubt have been forced to pay if the disaster had happened in 2019 instead of 1919, but it was still a huge amount by the standards of the 1920s. The lawsuit, though, represented more than that. The molasses flood was, in actuality, the beginning of the end for both the centuries-old New England molasses trade and for USIA. After World War I, the price of sugar dropped precipitously, to the point that Americans stopped using molasses as a substitute sweetener when they could get their hands on the real thing. Rum distilling had long been moved to large plants in the Caribbean even before Prohibition made alcohol production and consumption illegal in the US, while advancements in explosives manufacturing meant that industrial alcohol was no longer needed to make munitions. USIA eventually disappeared from the
Damn.
American
Oh.
business landscape in 1943 when it merged with one of its subsidiaries to form the U.S. Industrial Chemicals Corporation, which itself disappeared after a merger in 1951.
Legacy.
The Boston Molasses Flood showcased to the city of Boston that it needed to keep a tighter rein on building construction of all types within city limits
definitely.
to prevent a similar disaster from happening again. Boston began requiring all architectural plans be submitted with all calculations and drawings included, stamped with the seal of a certified engineer before the city would issue a building permit. Every other major city in the United States followed Boston's example, probably without even realizing that the catalyst for this move towards building safety was a tank full of molasses bursting open on a warm winter day in 1919. The disaster has another more colorful legacy attached to it as well. Americans don't use too much molasses these days aside from a few traditional dishes that still use it. Most of the molasses consumed in the US today is in the form of brown sugar, which is molasses mixed with white sugar that's a popular ingredient in baked.
Why did I not know that brown sugar was made with molasses? All right.
Goods. However, the molasses flood of 1919 spawned an urban legend in the city of Boston that on hot summer days, you
Okay, at least I'm not alone then.
can still smell a faint odor of molasses in the air. The legend isn't true, of course, anymore, but residents of Boston swore that as late as the 1960s, you could still smell molasses if you went into the old basements on Commercial Street that had been flooded in 1919. Aside from a small plaque near the side of the tank whose foundations are still there, buried under the youth baseball diamond that sits on the site today, that odor was the only monument to what is probably the strangest disaster ever to befall an American city. I hope you learned something today, and if you dug this video, be sure to smash that like button, comment something for us to read.
Yeah, apparently we learned that brown sugar is made from molasses, so okay. Okay. Hello, Loki. How are you doing? Wow. A friggin' molasses flood. Holy crap. Yeah, brown sugar is white sugar and molasses. I never knew that. I didn't know. Now I want friggin' oatmeal with brown sugar too. Holy shit. Or cream of wheat is delicious too. Yum.